Our planet is home to an immense array of species, and all have a high potential of reproduction. If there were no controls on this reproduction, mosquitoes would cover the Earth to the depth of 1/3 of a meter within one growing season. But in nature, there are limits and patterns to population growth. The study of population dynamics provides information with a wide range of application, all the way from planning effective pest control to conserving habitat to saving endangered species. Program, we'll learn about patterns of population growth and factors in the environment which affect them. We'll look at techniques for conserving and managing populations. We'll see how we are saving endangered species and preserving habitats. And we'll examine factors involved with pest control. By the end of the program, you'll have an appreciation of how populations change over time and how these changes ultimately will affect us all. Okay, if we're going to study population growth, we should have populations. What have we got here?
I'm growing yeast.
I've got fruit flies.
And I've got a cream puff, covered in bacteria.
Remember that. Now, you've been asked to monitor your populations, collect your data, and graph your results. If we put the number of organisms along the y-axis and time along the x-axis, what will your graph look like?
Well, I figure mine will look like a straight line. Like this. The population should keep growing over time.
Well, I think mine's gonna be more like a semicircle. Because eventually, they'll run out of food and die.
Yes, and mine is going to be J-shaped.
You sound pretty definite about that one, Cam.
Yeah, how do you know?
Well, I've been doing some calculations on my culture here, and the numbers just seem to be taking off.
Let's look at these cultures. Now, we've put a few organisms in an ideal environment. What's happening inside here?
Well, bacteria are organisms that reproduce really quickly. So if they're under ideal conditions, they should be reproducing at their maximum.
That means that the population is doubling every 20 minutes.
That's exponential growth. At that rate, there'd be over 1 million in 7 hours. On a graph, the line would just go straight up.
But it won't go on forever, because there's only so much cream on that puff. And just like that, my fruit flies are going to die too, because eventually they'll run out of food and space.
And Vanessa, what about your yeast? Do they produce a waste product?
Alcohol.
Okay, keep going.
Well, I guess if it becomes too concentrated, then all the yeast will die.
Good. Now, you people have brought up some very interesting points about population growth. Now, what will the graph really look like?
Well, in the end, I think it'll look like a J-shaped curve with rapid growth. But after a while, as they run out of food, it'll drop off like this, and they'll die.
Good. Well done. Now, let me clarify a few points about population while we're here. Population growth curves are based on mathematical models. In biology, the letter R is used to represent growth rate. So they are called R-selected populations. One characteristic is that they are seasonal, like insects or algae. Now, continue with your data and graph your results. And Cam, don't eat that experiment.
The shape of the growth curve in a population is initially determined by 2 factors. These are the birth rate and the death rate. When a population enters a new environment, there is an adjustment time, or lag phase, where population growth is delayed. During this period, the birth rate is only slightly higher than the death rate, and the impact on population size is minimal due to initial low numbers. When conditions for growth are ideal and reproduction accelerates, the population reaches its biotic potential. the birth rate far exceeds the death rate and the population grows at a maximum rate. This is called the exponential growth phase. When graphed, the growth curve is J-shaped. Populations exhibiting this type of growth are called R-selected. The organisms within these populations are generally small in size, have a short lifespan, usually seasonal, and produce many offspring.
Okay, we studied populations in the lab growing under ideal conditions. But what about natural populations?
Well, if they grew the same way, then we'd be up to our elbows in organisms.
Let's look at a natural population. We'll study the burrowing owl. It's a bird that lives on the prairies. It feeds off insects and other small organisms. Now, suppose we took a group of these owls and placed them in a habitat and monitored their growth over a period of time. What would be the shape of their growth curve?
Assuming they survived, and after an initial period to get adjusted to their area, the reproductive rate should increase, just like the experiments in our lab.
Yeah, but they're in the wild. They've got to find their own food, find a place to nest, put up with the weather. I think nature isn't quite as controlled as our lab.
Not to mention predators, especially on the young.
There's only so much food and resources, and after a while the numbers would level off.
Yeah, I agree with you. After the initial lag phase, the rate of population growth is fast. But as space and resources get used up, the growth rate slows down.
That's a good analogy.
I have another model here. Let's pretend these muffin tins are nesting sites for the owls. As the number of owls in the nesting sites increase, space becomes a limiting factor.
But if it were an open population, then some owls could leave.
And other owls could move in. And some could die, and some would get eaten.
Which would make room for even more owls to come in. I think that the population would remain pretty much constant if all the factors were interacting.
Now, from what we've discussed over here, what will the shape of this curve look like?
Well, I think it would look something like this. At first there would be a rapid growth, but after a while the numbers would level off.
Ah, very good. This is called a logistic or S-shaped curve. Many populations live in habitat where resources are limited. As the population increases in numbers, the amount of resources available for each organism gets less and less. This is called the carrying capacity of the environment. Now, in science, K represents a constant. So populations who live in habitats where their numbers remain fairly constant are called K-selected populations. They're usually larger animals like caribou, elk, humans, or fuzzballs.
Many populations in their natural environment typically exhibit a logistic growth curve. The initial slow growth is followed by a rapid period of growth, resulting in a marked increase in population numbers. But as the population size increases to approach the carrying capacity of the environment, factors such as lack of food or habitat, disease, and predation exert a resistant pressure on their growth. Population growth reaches a plateau. The result is a characteristic S-shaped growth curve. The population reaches equilibrium or stationary phase with the carrying capacity of the environment. Should conditions in the environment change, a new carrying capacity will be established. Populations that exhibit this type of growth pattern are called K-selected. The organisms are usually larger in size, with longer lifespans and low reproductive rates.
Well, the swift fox is a species that's extirpated, that is extinct in their range in Canada, and they are unique to the Great Plains of North America, and they were found in archaeological digs north of Edmonton, 7,500-year-old swift fox bones that were ritually killed, the archaeologists guess, by the Plano peoples. So they're an integral part of the Great Plains Indians' cultural history, as well as just being an integral part of the Great Plains. And there's only 8 attempts to reintroduce extirpated mammals worldwide. That is, reintroduce animals that are no longer occur in their original range into their original range. And this, of those 8 attempts, this is the one that is the closest to success because it complies with all the criteria for successful reintroduction. We have a wide genetic heterozygosity in the breeding colony, and we have a large breeding colony capable of putting out significant numbers of animals. Because obviously if you put out, say, 15 animals and you have a die-off which is inevitable of 50%, you're not left with very many out of 15. But if you put out 90, you're left with a whole lot more, even if you have a 50% die-off. And that means if you're left with more animals, they're more likely to meet up and breed. And the foxes have bred successfully in the release sites and successfully raised their young. So the niche that was available is still there. They've demonstrated that it is.
Okay, people, look at this. Another graph. These are survivorship curves. First thing we have to do is interpret them. Cam, will you start?
Sure. All right, well, on the y-axis here, we have survivors per 1,000, and on the x-axis, we have age. So if we take a look at the A curve, we can see that the line stays fairly high, meaning only a few organisms die off in the early years. Most of them die off as they get older.
Well, I'd say that curve B is quite the opposite. The line drops quickly in life, which means that most of the population die when they're very young.
It seems that if you can make it through early childhood, you have a better chance of survival.
That's well done. Now, here's the problem. There are two curves on this graph. We've studied two populations, R-selected and K-selected. Which curve belongs to which population?
Well, K-selected is S-shaped for large animals, mammals.
Well, which curve is that?
Mammals tend to protect and nurse their young, so they have a higher chance of survival. That's represented in curve A. So curve A is K-selected.
Well, our selected populations reproduce really quickly. The mosquitoes and flies lay thousands of eggs, but their young are really helpless, and they die off really quickly. That's why I would say that curve B is R-selected.
That's excellent reasoning. Now remember that these curves represent ideals, and natural populations fall somewhere between the boundaries of the two. Where's Cam?
I'm over here.
Where's that?
I'm with Jane from the mosquito control program. She's showing me how they monitor mosquito populations.
Basically, we start by monitoring the larval population in the water, and we check with the dipper, check how many mosquito larvae are inside the dipper, and we can go from 0 to hundreds inside the dipper. If it's 25 or over in most of the dips, then that's when they say that we should be starting a control program of some kind. We have 3 different options for control. We can have something like this, which is a hormone type control. It's a hormone impregnated into a charcoal briquette, and we toss it in the water and it'll dissolve. The hormone released will prevent the larvae from pupating, which means that they'll never hatch and never become adults. This one here is a bacteria impregnated into a grain or corn meal of some kind, and this is sprinkled onto the top of the water. It'll float down into the water. The mosquitoes will eat it, or the larvae of the mosquitoes will eat it, and the bacteria inside this will eat the midgut of the larvae, and that will eventually kill them. Actually, it's a 24-hour kill. This one here is called Dursban. It's an organic chemical which will kill the mosquitoes on contact. It's what we call a contact poison. This is what we use in more serious cases, bigger problem cases.
The rationale for mosquito control looks at a couple of perspectives. First of all, the medical importance. We're pretty lucky in Alberta in that the mosquitoes that we deal with here are not known, at least known vectors or carrying pathogens that can affect humans. On an economic perspective, insects such as mosquitoes also can impact us on a parks and recreation side, i.e. allowing the general public to use the parks. If there's lots of mosquitoes out, people aren't going to be out using our parks. There's also an economic impact on outdoor businesses.
What are you doing, Vanessa?
I'm looking at the results of a lab that I did. I'm looking to see the effects of environmental conditions on population growth.
So, what did you do?
Well, I used yeast cells in different environmental conditions. One was in the cold, one had more food, and one was in an acidic environment with a pH of 3.
What about a control?
Well, I grew some more yeast in another test tube with 1 milliliter glucose solution and a pH of 7.
So you set up all the test tubes the same, except for the variables you were testing.
That's right. And then I filled them up with distilled water, and I put the cold one in the fridge and kept the others at room temperature.
Then what was your hypothesis?
Well, what do you think? I had 3 different environmental conditions. One was cold, a greater supply of food, and an acidic condition.
Well, if the yeast had a greater supply of food, it means they'd have a greater supply of energy.
So there should be more in that test tube than in the control.
And cold would slow down their metabolism, so there'd be less yeast produced in the fridge.
And then there was that acidic environment with a pH of 3.
Well, things generally don't grow well in acid, so I'd guess there wouldn't be much growth there. And what did you measure and record?
Oh, it was really neat. I used the spectrophotometer.
A
what?
A spectrophotometer. It's used to measure the amount of light that passes through a solution in a test tube. The greater the amount of yeast that's growing, the less light will pass through. I recorded the results every 15 minutes and compared them with the standard. And that's what we have here.
So were we right?
Well, it looks that way. The third line down represents the control tube, the amount of light passing through versus time. Now remember, the less light, the more organisms there are.
What's the bottom line?
That's the yeast with the increased food. Everything else being equal, the more food, then the greater the number of organisms.
Then the top 2 lines must represent the acidic environment and the cold. Which one grew less?
The top one. The acid affects enzyme activity in the cells. There was little change in the number of organisms at all. In the cold environment, you could see that there was some growth, but not as much as the control.
So what does it mean? How does this apply to what we've learned?
Well, different reasons could account for a decline or stoppage in population growth. Something could be affecting the food supply.
Acid rain could do it.
Or it could be due to a cold year, disease, predation, or hunting.
Look at this data on the burrowing owl population.
It looks like it's taken a dip lately.
It's been put on the endangered species list. I know someone who's trying to save the owls. We should go see him.
We just learned that the burrowing owl is becoming an endangered species. Can you think of any reasons why this might be?
Well, we've identified quite a few man-made reasons. Number one being loss of habitat, land being cultivated, expansion of cities and roads being built. Also the use of some insecticides have shown to be very toxic to the owls. Some are shot because they're mistaken for ground squirrels out in the fields. A lot of them get hit by cars, but probably the biggest mystery is that we don't know where they spend their winters at.
What's the future of the burrowing owl?
In 1989, there's a program started called Operation Burrowing Owl, and it's modeled after a similar program in Saskatchewan. And what we do is encourage people to report sightings of owls. And if the owls are nesting on private property, then we talk to landowners and see if they'd like to voluntarily protect some of the habitat around the burrow.
How would it fit into an overall picture?
Well, the burrowing owl really visually demonstrates the interdependency from one species to another, because first the ground squirrel has to go in and dig his burrow. Then the badger will follow, and after the badger's done, then he makes a nice burrow for the burrowing owl. But if you take the ground squirrel or the badger away, then you won't have any more burrowing owls. So in that instance, it's a really good demonstration of the interdependencies that exist in nature. I mean, they exist all the way from microorganisms all the way up, and a lot of those relationships we'll never, ever understand, but just being able to appreciate them is great.
Why is population management so important to us all?
Well, biodiversity is something that a lot of people take for granted and don't really think about a lot. We as human beings are only one of millions of species that share this planet, and yet in the short time that we've been on this planet, we've drastically altered the landscape to degrees that we're losing a lot of different species. And it's really hard to put a value. A lot of our society is driven on an economic base. And it's really hard to put the value on a burrowing owl, like to put a dollar value on it. But if we start losing species, we've seen where ecosystems have collapsed because, a very small or insignificant organism has been lost. There's a lot of medical benefits that are still yet to be untapped that could be living out there, quite possibly in the prairie. And the prairie ecosystem itself is probably one of the least appreciated but most endangered ecosystems that we do have right now.
Larry Simpson is a director of projects for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. The mission of the Nature Conservancy is to preserve the variety of plant and animal life within the nation in cooperation with the people.
I think maybe it's worthwhile touching upon why United Nations commissioned the World Conservation Strategy. They knew that the world, for the first time, that humanity, for the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, had achieved 1 billion in the mid-1800s. And by the mid-1900s, we were adding 1 billion about every 15 years. And the attendant impacts on global resources were so profound, they knew we had to talk and establish some principles, some guidelines under which societies conduct themselves. What does that mean in terms of conservation? Do we have to set aside lands? How much do we need to set aside? The question often arises as to the need to conserve biodiversity. And I guess the first thing I want to address is, what is biodiversity? And the Reader's Digest version or explanation of it is that if you happen to be driving, say, in the mountains, the plants and animals that you find there are going to be different from the plants and animals that you find on the prairies. They're different ecosystems. And the secret to conserving biodiversity is at 3 levels. You first of all have to conserve enough of each ecosystem to conserve enough of the species that have historically existed there, so that they will have enough genetic variability that they don't inbreed themselves out of existence. So there's 3 parameters to biodiversity. Got to have the space, the animals in sufficient numbers to have the genetics. And without all 3 of those, we further compromise biodiversity. Worldwide, we depend for the vast majority of our food sources from maybe 12 plants. And think of them: potatoes and rice and corn and wheat and barley, and it starts to get thin after that. We look in the mid-1970s, the corn blight to the U.S. was moving, I'm told, at the rate of 100 kilometers a day. And they began searching the world over for a wild genetic stock of corn that would defend against this pest. And they happened to find 10 acres in all the world of a particular corn plant in Mexico that had the genetic trait necessary to defend against this pest. They took that genetic trait, they married it to the domestic corn crop, and we still have productive corn crops throughout North America. So we're really truly dependent on a very small, minute segment of the plant domain for our food sources, and those are becoming increasingly produced in monocultures, and that the attendant risks suggest that we need to maintain biodiversity, simply for nothing else, just for agriculture. We need to reduce the risk. It's almost like having an insurance policy on our food production when we conserve diversity.
What we have to do is strive to maintain a viable ecosystem and all its operational components and the populations that are part of that ecosystem. We don't want to lose any habitat or species. But within that, there is room for management, for some degree of impact that doesn't eliminate the activity altogether. And I think that's probably what the original intent of terms like sustainable development was. You don't have a development scenario of any kind that impairs our ability to maintain ecosystems and populations of plants and animals. Governments have to give strong consideration to those people who are directly affected by land use decisions. There are many sectors of our society that make their living on the land, whether it be ranchers, farmers, outfitters, hunting guides. Those kind of people have a direct involvement and should have a direct participation in the decision-making process. There are limits to growth, and no one sector can have it all.
What are some of the risks and benefits of population management? Let's start with the mosquito control program that we saw.
Well, depends on what kind of management you're talking about, because there's all different sorts. Like
Pesticides.
that's the one that first comes to my mind too, because everybody has some sort of insecticide in their house, because it's easy to get and it works pretty quickly, I think. Hey?
It's cheap too, cheap and easy to use.
There are some drawbacks to it though. Like, for example, insects can develop a resistance to the pesticides if they're used too often and then they don't work anymore. Or it could get into the groundwater and affect other organisms.
Well, they had other methods of control as well.
They use biological things, like hormones or bacteria. That works pretty well because, well, first of all, it's better for the environment because it doesn't harm the other organisms, like you said.
The mosquito people didn't just control at random. They did sample populations and numbers to see if numbers, and they didn't really start controlling until the numbers were elevated to a high enough level that the mosquito actually became a pest. Now, what about the swift fox? Now, here we saw a breeding program and a reintroduction into the wild. What are some risk benefits of that program?
Well, there's a definite benefit. I mean, a species that's numbers are so low that we have to start breeding them and putting them back in the population. In effect, we're probably saving the population by introducing them back into a natural habitat.
But you can't necessarily be sure that they're going to survive out there, though. Right?
Well, I think that we have to do something about it because the reason that they're dying off is it's basically our own fault, really, because man alters their habitat so much that they can't live anymore, and so we've got to think of some way to reintroduce them.
Right, and there's also people who donate their land to conservation. Just natural sections of land that they just leave alone and don't develop so that species can naturally develop there and live there free from any development, any human contact.
And
that's a good idea.
Yeah, that's good. It's good for biodiversity too, because then you won't lose certain organisms of one kind, and then you'll just be left with one species.
What happens if we lose our biodiversity?
Well, if the adaptations of the certain animals that are left aren't what it takes to survive, then we could actually cause a species to become extinct.
In this program, you've learned that our selected populations are characterized by rapid population growth, resulting in a J-shaped curve. Growth rate in K-selected populations, on the other hand, is characterized by S-shaped curves. Remember that both the J-shaped and S-shaped curves represent ideal conditions. Natural populations fall somewhere between these boundaries.
We've also looked at different methods of managing populations, from the abatement and control of pests to the reintroduction of endangered species and the preservation of habitat. As you can see, there are no easy answers. The more we understand population dynamics, the better our chances of enhancing the quality of life for future generations.